Hello, good morning, and welcome to the 2021 CITE Annual Conference. This is our first ever virtual conference, and we're very excited to be meeting this way, and I hope we have a great conference over the next couple of days. My name is James Donnelly. I'm the chair of this conference's National Arrangements Committee, and very happy to be here and to kick things off today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I'm speaking to you today from Kelowna, British Columbia, on the unceded territory of the Syilx people. This is also near to the unceded lands of the Secwepemc Nation and where the undocumented remains of 215 children were recently discovered at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, a community and site that I have visited many times. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can, each in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. In particular, over the next few days, let's remember our responsibility as professionals to build safe and inclusive communities for all people. Now I'd like to introduce Julia Salvini, President of the Canadian Institute of Transportation Engineers.
Thanks very much for that acknowledgement, James. What a great reminder of the role that we play in our communities across Canada as we go into this conference. I just want to welcome everybody who's come to this conference from all across our Canadian district and visitors that we have from elsewhere as well. I'm coming to you from my home office in Kitchener, Ontario, where it's a beautiful sunny day, another hot one as it is in other parts of the country as well. We miss seeing you. I wish we could be together in person, but it's so great to gather here virtually. And I hope that you'll take advantage of the many opportunities to connect with colleagues from across the country. I would encourage you to use the chat feature, to use the video conference feature with the friends that you're connecting with on this virtual platform. They're really great. And we look forward to when we can meet together again in person in Vancouver. We have a really great program planned over the next several days. We have just a few highlights. The CITE Excellence in Transportation Awards program is happening on Wednesday during the plenary session, along with an address from Melissa Rodriguez, who's the president of IT International. Tonight we have our traffic bowl with our 4 student teams, so we encourage you to participate in that as well. I'd like to thank our diamond sponsor, ATS IntelliTraffic, who's sponsoring this session, and we'll have a few words from them in a few moments. Just a little bit about the conference. We've got about 350 delegates registered and many, many sponsors. And we encourage you to enjoy all of this conference has to offer. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Julia. So before we kick off the opening session, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you've had a chance to explore the conference platform, a little tip: if you'd like to use the account tab on the left, you can add a photo of yourself, you can add some information about that, and hopefully you can use this to connect with your other conference attendees. A couple other items: just make sure that you've got your notifications and pop-ups permitted through your browser. If you need any help with that, there is a help tab and instructions and more tips, as well as contact information if you're having any difficulties using the platform. You can always ask questions in the lobby chat box, and we look forward to connecting with you that way as well. Second, we have a great program, 10 technical tracks over the next 3 days. We've got some virtual tours as well as panel discussions. Just a quick note that the presentations are pre-recorded. So they'll be launched at the scheduled times. There will be a live Q&A session for most of the technical tracks. That will happen afterwards at the end of the track. So with several presenters doing their Q&As together. So definitely keep an eye out for that. If you'd like to have ask a few questions and interact with the presenters, that's the time to do that. So look out for the links of how to connect to those Q&A sessions. The tours and the panel discussions include the Q&A in the single session, so you don't have to do anything or have any delay in terms of when that happens. All the sessions, like I said, are pre-recorded. So after the conference, in a couple days, you will have access to all the presentations. So if you miss anything, I know a lot of people will be probably attending part-time time, as well as while they continue on with their daily jobs. You can go back and you can catch up on some of the presentations that you missed. So that would be a great thing to take advantage of. Don't forget that our top sponsors have organized some thought leader roundtables, and those will happen in a couple hours after the first couple sessions. There's 3 concurrent roundtable discussions each day, wide variety of topics. These will all be mostly live sessions, so you'll have a lot of opportunity in terms of asking questions, interacting, discussing things with your colleagues. So they'll be a little bit different and hopefully something that will really benefit your experience of the conference. With that, I'm very happy to send us off to our opening plenary session. First, we're going to hear a message from Steve Ennis from our diamond sponsor, IntelliTraffic, a division of ATS Traffic.
Thanks, James. Much appreciated. It's an honor to be able to introduce the opening plenary for the CITE 2021 virtual conference. My name is Steve Ennis, and I'm the Executive Vice President for IntelliTraffic, which is the newest division of ATS Traffic. ATS Traffic has been in operation since 1966, and while some view us as a manufacturer, a distributor, or a service provider, I would argue our greatest successes and biggest top-line leaps in our financial statements have come through the introductions of the newest traffic technologies. The first technology our founder, Lauren Hooper, there's Lauren, introduced to the market, and where ATS Traffic got its start, was a kerosene-lit barricade flasher. As unsafe as it now sounds, it was a new piece of equipment that solved the problem of work zone barricades that were difficult for motorists to see during nighttime hours. We then became Western Canada's largest fabricator of 3M reflective signs. While reflective sheeting has become somewhat of a commodity, the concept of a reflective adhesive that would illuminate in the headlights of a vehicle was revolutionary and changed the way the infrastructure communicated with motorists, not to mention making roads much safer through more visible signs. Our next technology offering was solar-powered portable variable message signs. Leveraging solar and LED technology, temporary programmable signs that could operate without an AC power source improved the driving experience for all motorists and increased safety with advanced warning of changes to normal traffic flow that lay ahead. With such a focus on technology and intelligent transportation systems these days, we decided to create a division solely focused on these pursuits. And this division is IntelliTraffic. IntelliTraffic is primarily interested in deploying and managing and maintaining systems that generate rich data sets, producing the information required to make intelligent decisions, whether they be people-based or AI-based. We're also deeply interested in the communication technologies required to bring these systems to life. Our institutional research through the University of Alberta's Centre for Smart Transportation is focused on digitizing infrastructure, with a particular focus on work zone digitization to support connected and autonomous vehicles. What a time it is to be involved in this sector, in this space, and in this industry. Technology has wrapped itself around us so tightly that we have to embrace the hug. Cars are starting to drive themselves. Cyclists can get from point A to point B just as, or even more conveniently than vehicles are able to. Elon Musk is putting satellites up in the sky to enable communication, whether you're in the middle of New York or on the top of Mount Everest. We understand who uses our roadways, where their journey started, where it ends. It's fascinating stuff, and we're the ones going to make it all happen. Our opening plenary will take the audience into the world of active transportation and the importance of designing for all ages and abilities. With an aging population and growing disability rates in Canada, there's a significant need for deliberate action regarding mobility and accessibility for people living with disabilities. Andy Fillmore, MP, Halifax and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities, and Marnie Peters, with Accessibility Simplified, will hold a conversation with Dr. Jeannette Montufar about the future of active transportation in Canada and the opportunities that lie ahead for us to become leaders in creating inclusive communities. Andy Fillmore was first elected to the Member of Parliament for Halifax in 2015. He has also served as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities since 2019. Before being elected as a Member of Parliament, Mr. Fillmore spent 20 years as an urban planner and community builder in the private, public, and academic sectors. He is a founding member and former Vice President of the Canadian Council for Urbanism. As Halifax's first manager of urban design, his work included projects like the new Halifax Central Library and HRM by Design, a planning strategy to increase development in downtown Halifax. He also served as director and associate professor at the Dalhousie University School of Planning and was the Vice President of Planning and Development at the Waterfront Development Corporation in Halifax, where he oversaw the ongoing development of Halifax's mixed-use waterfront. Mr. Fillmore co-founded the Halifax Strategic Urban Partnership in 2010 and won a National Urban Leadership Award in 2012. Mr. Fillmore holds a Bachelor of Environmental Design Studies in Architecture and a Master of Urban and Rural Planning from Dalhousie University, and a Master in Design Studies in Urban Design from Harvard University. He grew up in Halifax and is a proud champion for his hometown in Canada's Parliament. Marnie Peters has over 20 years of experience as an accessibility consultant, offering comprehensive services related to accessibility and universal design. Marnie's thorough understanding of accessibility and universal design enables her to evaluate all environments from the perspective of how persons with the full range of human conditions, including people with a range of disabilities, use and interact with buildings, facilities, and active transportation and associated public realm environments. Marnie provides accessibility consulting services to architects, landscape architects, urban planners, interior designers, project managers, and other design professionals, working with or on behalf of institutional or commercial clients and developers to ensure the implementation of accessible, inclusive, and universal design concepts into their designs. Marnie is the accessibility consultant to the project team for the redevelopment of Ontario Traffic Manual Book 18, cycling facilities, providing technical advice in regards to pedestrian safety, accessibility, and where necessary, the appropriate locations and type of implementation of TWSIs. She is currently providing services in relation to the installation of cycling facilities to a number of traffic engineering firms, including two, the City of Ottawa on a number of projects in relation to addressing pedestrian safety and accessibility in relation to cycling facilities and infrastructure, ALSA in regards to the development of the City of Ottawa Protected Intersection Design Guidelines and a number of cycling facility installations, Morrison Hirschfield in regards to the City of Ottawa bus stops and off-road cycling facilities, Interaction Zone Design Guidelines, and Parsons in relation to the City of Ottawa Local Residential Streets 30 kilometers an hour Design Toolbox, and Robinson Consulting, WSP, and Stantec in regards to a number of cycling facility implementations. I'll pass it over to the founding partner and CEO of MORR Transportation Consulting and former CITE President, Jeannette Montufar. Jeannette?
I am Jeannette Montufar. I am President and CEO of MORR Transportation Consulting. I am speaking to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, where we have a gorgeous day today. I have been watching the chat, and I see that the weather is beautiful in many places of the country. Well, right now in Winnipeg, it's 25 beautiful degrees Celsius, and it's going to go up to 31 degrees. What an honor it is for me to be here today chairing this opening plenary. As Julia said in the opening remarks, you know, we would love to be meeting in person. And in my case, I would love to be hugging many of you and taking walks with others. And in the past, I used to go for runs with some of you, but you know, there's something called age in my case. And so I have decided that walking is safer than running. I know, Edward, I know what you're thinking, but that's okay. You're just a total athlete. I am not. So, but I hope that if things continue to get better over the next few months, that we're going to be able to see each other in person again. So, so thank you so much for joining us virtually. And while it's not possible to see each other in person and enjoy like we always do at this conference, I think it is really good that we're at least seeing each other virtually. So I would like to invite Andy Fillmore and Marnie Peters to maybe get your camera going and get this conversation going. So today's opening session is titled "All Ages and Abilities Are Welcome: The Future of Active Transportation in Canada." So the idea with this session is to take everyone into the world of active transportation and the importance of designing for all ages and abilities. Of course, as we know, with an aging population and growing disability rates in Canada, there is a significant need for deliberate action regarding mobility and accessibility for people living with disabilities. We have today two wonderful speakers. I am very grateful to have the opportunity to be joined by them because I know that their knowledge and experience have made a significant impact in the transportation systems of various communities in Canada. And what I thought we would do is we're going to start our session with some opening remarks from each of them, about 10 minutes or so. I'm just going to open it up to maybe start with Andy, and you have about 10 minutes. Use as many of those minutes as you'd like, just to give us your opening remarks. And then we're going to go to Marnie. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jeannette. And can I just ask, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you for that introduction. And Marnie, let me just say it's a great pleasure to, we're not sharing the podium today, but we're sharing the screen. And please let me say thank you for all of your important work in the world of accessibility. And hello to everybody tuning in today. It's been great to see the place names streaming in. I'm looking for familiar names and familiar places, and I see lots of them there. I beg your pardon. Today I'm joining you from Mi'kma'ki, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, where we are all treaty people. I want to, I'm so excited. I'm getting a little, choking a little bit because I'm so happy to be with you all, because you are really my people. I feel like I'm in with my family right now. You heard what Jeannette say. I've been a planner for feels like my whole life. And although I am not a practicing planner at the moment in the conventional way, I'm always a planner. People ask me what I do. My first answer is always, I'm a planner. Right now, I happen to be the member of Parliament for Halifax, but I want you to know that I take that community building with me into Parliament. And remarkably, I found out that I am not just the only planner in Parliament, but the first planner in Parliament. Lawyers we got, community builders we need. So look, if anyone's looking for the next challenge, we could really use you in Ottawa. So give that some thought. It's another great way to do community service. Now, I know this year's conference is virtual, so we're looking very much forward to the day that we can all reconnect in person. It's been a rough year for so many Canadians across the country. And I just want to extend my best and warmest wishes to all of you joining virtually. We're coming out of this quickly. The vaccines are happening ahead of schedule, and we're going to be back to whatever our new normal is this summer. So let's just stick with it for the final stretch here. Now, I know that CITE has a great conference set up all this week that's going to inspire many interesting and important conversations about the future of the sector. And one of those is our topic today. And I just want to sort of to frame it a little bit, say that in my career as a planner in those different sectors, including as a sole proprietor of a small business at one point, a small consultancy, I've had the opportunity to work with so many incredible and talented engineers, planners, municipal leaders, community builders. And in fact, it was this experience that inspired me to run for office after seeing for a long time governments of the past doing just the bare minimum to keep our crumbling infrastructure in workable condition. And we might all remember the FCM scorecard on municipal infrastructure back in 2014. In some communities, in fact, we even see complete infrastructure gaps in critical infrastructure like water infrastructure or clean energy, broadband connectivity that all of us and our families rely on every single day. And so given my DNA, it's a thrill for me every day to be part of a government that has made these historic investments in community infrastructure through our Investing in Canada infrastructure program, $180 billion, almost $15 billion for public transit, including a permanent public transit fund that's going to reach out into the future. Doubling of the what was the gas tax fund is now the community building fund. You put all this together and we're really talking about a new deal. This is like FDR New Deal level investment in our communities, preparing us for the future and our kids and grandkids. And I may be relevant to this audience. I just want to reassure you that with my lonely planner's voice in Parliament, I've advocated relentlessly for engineering, planning, and design studies and other kind of preliminary project expenses to be eligible expenses under our programming. And I'm very happy to say that now practically all of our programs include planning and design and engineering work as eligible project expenses. Now, this has created more certainty for project proponents, but at the same time, it supports really important planning and engineering jobs and design jobs that power our economy and our communities. And I have to also say that funding this kind of work, this upfront work, has also made a front door for a lot of communities that simply don't have the staff or fiscal capacity for that kind of preliminary work, and now they do. So that's a little bit of talk about community, but I want to just say that this is the work that inspires, it's community that really inspires the work that I do every day, and it's the work that planners and engineers and community builders like all of you do every day, and I know that we all find this extremely inspiring. And as we know, during these challenging times, community is more than just a word. They're where we grow up, where we're educated, where we work and raise our families, and sometimes we even travel in between communities to get where we need to go. So in many ways, and not to sound like a Pollyanna about it, but a silver lining, if you'll allow me, that I've seen to come out of the COVID-19 pandemic is this reinvigorated connection that Canadians have to their communities. This is why, for example, our government created the Healthy Canada, the Canada Healthy Communities Initiative, CHCI, born in my living room last summer, and now a $31 million fund that has supported small-scale, pop-up, cheap and cheerful infrastructure projects in over 250 communities across the country. And I wouldn't at all be surprised if some folks on the call today have been involved in a CHCI application. So this is important because, you know, we're all proud of our communities, and we know that in order to build the future that we all want, a future that is green and inclusive, we have to make those strategic investments today so that they'll pay off for us tomorrow. Which brings us to the topic today, one that is near and dear to my heart: active transportation and the infrastructure that supports it: bike lanes, pathways, trails, laneways, mixed-use trails, and more. Now, last year's, you may remember, some of you may remember, that about just before the pandemic began, so last February, 16 months or so ago, I announced very publicly that I had been asked by Minister Catherine McKenna to lead Canada's first national active transportation strategy, and there was an incredible response from the national cycling and AT community. But about 3 weeks later, COVID came along and put a big stick in our spokes, and we had to retrench, and government got distracted with the health crisis and with vaccines and with stimulus and so forth. I touched on this a second ago, but I think there actually was a silver lining here, because communities, and I'm sure you were part of it, started to think about our public spaces differently. We saw pop-up wider sidewalks, pop-up bike lanes. We saw local retailers using the adjacent park as a safe place to continue to run their business, but with social distancing. So we kind of reinvented almost our connection to public space in our communities. And so that reality allowed me and others to make the case to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet that we don't just need an active transportation strategy, we actually need an active transportation fund to bolster that strategy, to give it life, to put the wind under its wings. And you might remember earlier this year, the Prime Minister announced $15 billion for public transit. And as part of that funding, we secured $400 million for our first ever active transportation fund. We've also had conversations with planners and advocates across the country, engineers, municipal leaders. All of these voices have come together to shape the strategy that we'll be releasing in another month or so. You have been absolutely invaluable in the work that we do in this strategy and with this fund. And the feedback that we've been hearing has been consistent with what my own community here in Halifax wants, and that Canadians want across the country and have for a long time. They want active transportation that's safe, that's accessible, that takes them from where they need to go, all the while helping to reduce our carbon footprints. This is how we make our communities livable with this kind of work. And as a parent, I know a lot of us are thinking about our kids and looking for ways to inspire them. It seems impossible at sometimes, inspire them to be active and healthy and to be outdoors and off their phones. But this is going to help them to do that. And it's not just kids. We know that people live longer, happier, healthier, more productive lives when they're physically active, which, by the way, also reduces the burden on our public health system. And I know Marnie is going to discuss in her remarks accessibility. We know that accessibility means so much more than just physical accessibility. I want to leave that for her to unpack. Our active transportation and public transit networks have to be accessible to all Canadians, all abilities, all walks of life. And Canadians want AT infrastructure that is also inclusive and equitable, reaching groups that typically don't find AT accessible. I just want to share a stat that I saw in a tweet 2 days ago from Vancouver. It's stats from, it looks something like this, it's a nice little infographic, but it's stats from a 2-hour window of a popular bike lane in AT lane in downtown Vancouver. And a couple of the quick points are perceived gender, 61% male, perceived age group, 79% adult, perceived ethnic origin, 74% white, hardly anybody else even in double digits. So who is biking for 2 hours in Vancouver was basically a bunch of white men. And this tells us the work that lies ahead for us in AT infrastructure. We need to do better. So I'm going to wind it up here, but just as important as an investment in active transportation and public is investment in public transit. These together, this employs thousands of Canadians every year. So there's an economic side to this as well that I don't want to overlook. Investments in active transportation have shown to have some of the highest job multipliers per $1 million invested, averaging out to about 11.5 jobs. This is one of the highest job multipliers in the transportation sector through AT. And that doesn't even take into account the important health and environmental and equity benefits that can't be forgotten. So you could probably tell we could talk for hours about all this, and we're going to unpack a lot of this more in Q&A and in Marnie's conversation. So before I pass over the mic, I just want to say again, thanks to you all. Thanks for the important work that you do every single day. Because what you do is building our communities, that we continue to work together, we can deliver the communities that Canadians want and need in order to thrive as we come out of this pandemic. So I'll leave it there and pass the mic over. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Andy. I can definitely see your passion about the topic. So thank you so much. Marnie, I'm going to pass it over to you. And I know you have a presentation you would like to show.
I do.
Okay.
So I just wanted to thank Andy for the great introduction. It's almost like you had seen my presentation, because many of the points I want to touch on are things that you also touched on. So let me just see if I can make the technology work and pick the right screen. Okay. And so the reason I actually did a bit of a slide deck for today was, so every time I run into a transportation engineer or a planner, they always have questions about accessibility. And I thought, what a better way to use my 10 minutes than to maybe share a little bit of the knowledge I have and answer, some of the top questions that always come up for me. And so I'll just see if I can get this going. Oops, there we go. So we often hear these 4 terms, barrier-free design, accessible design, universal design, and universal accessibility. And often people use them interchangeably as if they all mean the same thing. But really, the language here shows the evolution of the way we think about accessibility for people with disabilities. So barrier-free design comes from sort of that basis of it's a modification to the built environment. Usually it meant something in the built environment having to do with adding a ramp onto the back of an existing building. So it was for one specific disability to address a specific problem. So people, of course, realized that wasn't good enough. We moved on to accessible design. And that was really about addressing what is accessibility for people who use mobility devices, and what is accessibility for people with vision loss or hearing loss. So it was really still sort of that checklist approach of making sure we address specific disabilities. And then came universal design, which recognized designing for everyone. So whether it was a building or something specific, it was about considering how all users might want to use a building. So I talk in the building sense because in large part, that's my background. Accessibility is now just becoming more explored in the public realm and within active transportation. But the same sort of premises apply. So when we think about universal design, it's really about designing for everyone. But usually it's limited to that specific project that might have been in development, Whereas universal accessibility really thinks about the broader holistic approach to things. So who are our users? They're not just people with disabilities, they're seniors and older people, they're children, their families. And so how do we take a building and a right-of-way and active transportation and all of those parts and make sure that they're accessible for everybody? And that's where we come up with the access chain. And that's something that Andy mentioned in terms of taking people and being able to get them from point A to point B in whatever method they want to. And so the universal accessibility is a continuum. So we think of it as the links of a chain. And so you have to consider the full range of users throughout the full range of experience. And so it's the whole point of a person leaving home, being able to active transportation, take the bus to get to point B, to go into a building, to have lunch with their friends. It's that whole chain. And if any part of that chain is broken, from an accessibility perspective, it means, it's not working. We haven't achieved universal accessibility. When we think about people with disability, quite often the default is the wheelchair. Everybody sees it, everybody knows what it is. It means that person has some type of disability. But really, we need to think broader than that and think about people with sensory disabilities like vision loss, hearing loss, people with cognitive and different learning abilities, mental health issues, which a really big issue right now because of the pandemic. Everybody's been kind of locked at home. And it's, everybody wants to get out and meet people. And how do we achieve that? But also some more hidden disabilities like communication and speech disabilities, and of course, mobility. And so when we think about disability, for all the designers and planners who are listening to this talk, it's really about thinking about sort of the broadest user possible, not the people you would expect, like Andy mentioned, all the white men who are riding bicycles in Vancouver. Who are the users that we're not designing for? So if we look at just basic statistics, everybody think mobility is the highest one, when really it's only 10% of sort of the population of people with disabilities, whereas pain and flexibility is a big part. People with dexterity, hearing and seeing. So you see there's really who the people are with disabilities is a much broader range than maybe people think. I often get a question about codes and standards and legislation. So at the top of all this is our human rights legislation across Canada. So whether you're designing on public projects, so anything for the NCC, public works, you have to be considering the Canadian human rights legislation. In the provinces, or in territories, it's all of the provincial and territorial legislation. So essentially they trump all other legislation. They supersede everything. So whether you have a provincial accessibility act like in Ontario, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. In Nova Scotia, it's the Nova Scotia Disability Act. And from those have evolved different city standards and municipal standards, as well as some of the provincial standards like the integrated accessibility standards. So a lot of those to date haven't covered active transportation per se and how it impacts on accessibility. But the one thing that all the planners and designers and engineers have to remember is human rights legislation supersedes all of that. So just because the code or standard doesn't say you have to do something, it doesn't mean you don't have to do it. So essentially the human rights legislation says in the first case, you must remove barriers. And in the second case, you cannot create barriers. So it's really important that when you're designing that you consider whether or not your design is going to have an impact on the widest range of users. And although you might be making active transportation better in the sense of installing cycling facilities, what is the impact on vulnerable users such as people with vision loss, people with different cognitive abilities, and is it creating more barriers to use than currently exist? And so this is just some examples from Ontario and different jurisdictions of the type of guides that provide some information related to accessibility. Accessibility is not black and white. It's not a one size fits all. You really have to be able to consider what is the situation you're faced with. Is it a constrained? You're trying to fit something into an existing? Is it new? You're out in suburbia? And how does accessibility and active transportation fit into that type of space? So when we talk about safe interactions, it's really about, again, Andy touched on multi-use pathways and trails and things that are shared And then where do we have it? So multi-use pathway splits off into a sidewalk, and how do people know where to go, and how do people stay safe? And so from an accessibility perspective, I've been doing a lot of work, of course, with the design teams I work with in addressing those types of issues. And in many ways, we're kind of breaking new ground in terms of recognizing that accessibility has a really big part and a really big place to play in the design and implementation of cycling and active transportation facilities. So one of the biggest things that we've realized is the most important is maintaining that straight path of travel. When we look at the way that active transportation is being implemented with the bump ins for the cycling to make sure they have the 2 meters away from the roadway, what is the impact on pedestrians? And so for people with vision loss who can't see the change in sidewalk directions, it's really important that we maintain that straight path of travel. It's understanding how people navigate, particularly vulnerable users, and in particular people who are blind or have very low vision, using a long white cane or a guide dog. So we've had some exercises here and had some big training exercises for city staff at the City of Ottawa in terms of, how does a guide dog navigate? What do they think about Twizzies? Why did they walk straight when we put delineators for the sidewalk? And the truth is, guide dogs don't recognize Twizzies. It doesn't, those tactile walking surface indicators, it doesn't mean anything to them. So a dog will always take a straight path of travel. And so how do we design so people are able to maintain that straight path of travel, maintain their safety, and it works not, so anything that's going to work for their most vulnerable user is going to work for everyone. And so that's a really important consideration. So I wanted to show you just a couple good and a couple bad examples because they seem to come up all the time. So on the screen is an image of a cycle track separated with some rough pavers. And next to that is they've used the tactile walking surface indicator, but the indicator that's used as a directional wayfinding. So they've used it inappropriately because there's a certain height and dimension and spacing for tactile walking surface indicators that convey a specific message to people with vision loss as the route that's safe to travel. And in this case, they've installed them as a delineator, but it means that people are going to walk into a bollard every 20 feet. So it's really important that when we're installing delineators and demarcation, that we understand what is the message that we're conveying to people. So it's not always simple as just taking a rough surface and putting it in somewhere, because every surface has to have a meaning and a consistent meaning if you're trying to convey a message to users. So this was a good example. It shows the sidewalk has a color contrast from the delineator, which also contrasts from the cycle track. It's it's safe for wheelchair users to cross over. It's high enough for somebody using a long white cane to detect it. And so this is a type of example that we want to see, installed. Having said that, each sort of area in the country has its own challenges, whether it's sort of like weather, operations, maintenance. So there's not a one size sort of fits all solution. So it's important to work with the community of users, and that includes older people as well as people with disabilities in your designs and community consultations. And if you're not getting them to respond to your community consultations, then you need to do a better job to reaching out to those groups. So this is kind of what I want to close with, which is, what if the first question we asked was, what is so unique about this situation that it justifies exclusion? Instead of asking, how much does it cost to make it accessible? So we can't use cost as a basis for not making things more accessible and more inclusive and more usable. We can't use the excuse of, operations and maintenance, and that's not the way we do things here. It's really important that if we're going to start installing active transportation facilities and a different way of doing things within the public realm, that we consider all of the users, and we consider, how do we make this accessible, usable, and inclusive for everyone? And so whenever you're thinking about, is my active transportation design or is my public planning, plan for this area going to work? Think about not only the accessibility, but if you're creating barriers and then not using cost as a justification for creating barriers. So just some quick thoughts about accessibility I wanted to leave everybody with today. And I'm just really happy to have been invited and to sort of help open the door towards accessibility and recognizing the role that it plays in all of the work that you do.
Thank you very much, Marnie. That is an excellent presentation. Great number of thoughts that we can keep with us, and as we provide planning, design, operations, maintenance services to the communities. So I want to remind attendees to please type in any questions you may have in the chat box, and I will try to get to as many questions as possible during the conversation we are about to begin. So over the next 40 minutes or so, I would like to maybe chat a little bit about this topic and get your perspectives about some specific issues associated with accessibility and active transportation. But I want to start maybe by asking each of you, I'm going to start with Marnie, why is active transportation important to you?
It's important to me because right now I think there's a bit of a sort of a misconception about who uses active transportation and why. I think for many people, when they think about active transportation, they end up with the numbers that Andy had talked about in terms of like white men who are adults riding bikes, or that active transportation is only for recreation and commuters. So active transportation isn't just about people riding bikes or alternative modes. It could be about somebody using a wheelchair wheeling down the street. To me, active transportation is essentially anything that you're doing and you're moving, getting from point A to point B, and you're not using a vehicle. So I think it's important because ultimately it can result in better street design that's safer and more convenient, and provides active options for a wider range of users.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Andy, why is AT important to you?
Thanks, Jeannette. Well, I mean, the planner in me would say that, look, we have to do everything we can to get people out of cars, single occupant vehicles especially, and put them into active modes of transportation, because there's a GHG imperative, there's a livability imperative, there's an affordability imperative. There are all these important reasons to do it that have to do with the way that a city or a community functions well, and people can get from work to school to home to play, where all the places that they need to do without having the decision to own a car forced on them. So that's kind of like the planner view. But when I was doing the National Active Transportation Strategy engagement, the countrywide engagement, I got a sort of a user perspective on it as well. So we heard that interesting, almost two poles of the discussion. One was, active transportation is about getting people to work. We have to have separated bike paths, AT paths with curbs and separate signalized intersections. People have to get where they're going efficiently with the investment that is equitable to that of the investment in car infrastructure. Then there's the whole other sort of end of the spectrum, which is we need to get people outdoors. We have to have paths in nature. We have to have pressure dust through paths through our provincial and national parks. I have a colleague, in fact, an MP here in Nova Scotia, who, when he and his young family want to go biking, they live in a rural community, but when they want to go biking, they have to load their bikes onto their car and drive to the place where you ride your bike. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So there's a richness here. It's about how people live their lives and live their lives better, and we really need to develop the infrastructure that can accommodate and accelerate all that beautiful diversity of what AT means to everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned the engagement sessions that you have been holding with respect to the strategy. What can you share some of what you have heard in doing these engagement sessions? What are people telling you?
By far, the most common point that was raised was this question of equity. So in doing the Canada Healthy Communities Initiative, we paired with the Community Foundations of Canada, for one thing, helped us to roll out that program and flesh it out. But also there's a placemaker in Canada named Jay Pitter, and Jay that may be familiar to some folks on the line. And J focuses on helping communities to put an equity lens on their investments in active transportation and other public infrastructure. So it was quite a learning moment to work with her. She's brilliant. And I have started to now look at all of the work that we do around AT with that kind of equity lens, not just because of her, but because of what we heard in the consultations. In the Nova Scotia example, we had a gentleman who joined the call from Beachville, Nova Scotia. Beachville is an African Nova Scotian community. It's been around for hundreds of years in Nova Scotia, founded by Black loyalists after the American War of Independence. And he shared with us that the municipality has never invested a dime in active transportation infrastructure in that community. So we've got to change that. So I think was the headliner.
That's interesting, and you also mentioned, and I think Marnie, you also echoed that about the volumes of the white males participating in active transportation. Is there anything that you are aware of? Is there anything out there that exists that would allow for the encouragement of, say, the other segments of the population to use active transportation? And maybe I can go to Marnie first, see if you are aware of anything that may exist, or how we can actually motivate or make it easier for all segments of the population to use active transportation more.
I think that's an interesting question. And I think from the perspective of, say, people who use adapted cycles, I think right now they sort of feel that the space isn't for them, either because maybe they're not fast enough. Oftentimes, I think there's concern about, if I bring my adaptive cycle, whether it's a senior who's using a tricycle, trying to get to the grocery store, or somebody who's trying to be active with their family using a hand cycle, is that active transportation route, is that cycle route sort of wide enough for their adaptive cycle? What happens when they get to an intersection? So they may feel, I think there's sort of like not yet that confidence that the active transportation routes have been adequately designed to consider the modes of transportation and the modes of equipment that they're bringing onto the routes. And so I think part of that education, sort of that global education across Canada, needs to be that active transportation is for everyone, and that facilities are being designed and considered considering the needs of other users other than a two-pedal bike. And so I think as things continue to evolve and grow, I think hopefully that confidence in that range of users will also grow with it. And I think, Andy's plan that's being implemented across the country, giving municipalities and smaller communities even, the money and the resources they need to start implementing and building out that type of infrastructure, hopefully we'll see a wider diversity of users actually using the facilities.
And
that's the hope. In fact, I mentioned that some of the $400 million fund will go toward the planning and design studies. I didn't mention another thing, which is that there's another carve off for outreach, so that we can push the strategy out into communities and get some really good pickup. And that strategy itself has embodied within it these intentions around equity. So I think it really is, the question is kind of really about how you engage, about the importance of engaging authentically with communities to hear what they need. And to do that authentically, you have to go to where they are, meet them where they are, to have those conversations. So it's my great hope that this strategy, when we partner with active transportation organizations across the country, we'll be able to go right to where people are and hear from them what they need, and then the funding would follow.
I'm just going to add one point, Jeannette, just because I just read a chat. So one of the questions was, if our community has no particular identified disability, should we design for all users? Should the design be universally accessible all the time? And my answer is yes. Because a lot of people have invisible disabilities. And also, if you don't design it to be accessible, then people with disabilities can't get out. So you won't see them in the community. So it's kind of like, if you don't build it, they can't come, right? So we always need to be thinking, like, this needs to be usable for anybody, because maybe tomorrow I'm going to move to your community and I am a wheelchair user. And so I want to bring my adaptive cycle and all my other things. And so really it's about, just because you don't see disability in your community doesn't mean it's not there. Maybe your community is just not accessible for them to actually be out there.
It is actually interesting, that point, Marnie. When I was, so in my previous life, I was a professor in transportation engineering at the University of Manitoba. And I used to say to my students, when you are designing or planning for different users, you have to go out and you look at what you don't see. What is it that you are not seeing? And maybe the reason that you're not seeing those people is because we are not properly planning and designing for them. So I want to go back to the point you made, Andy, with respect to the funding. And this is a groundbreaking funding opportunity that the federal government has put forward in terms of active transportation. And I wonder is this something that you think is going to be a long-term strategy where the federal government will continue to try to provide this type of funding on a more regular basis, or is this a one-time situation? Like, have you had any discussions about the future of this?
Yes, and I thank you for the question. It's I always say that every good planner has to be a little bit subversive. Like you're trying to make change in the world, and sometimes you have to go out there and find clever ways to make that change and lead opinion and lead people down a path. So what we've been able to do by establishing this strategy was then establish the need for a fund, and now that we have the fund in place, how could we ever take it away? So, this is 5-year funding, but if you'll recall, and folks who are tuned in that are involved in doing applications for investing in Canada infrastructure plan projects will know that ICIP money sunsets in 2026. But the Prime Minister announced we're going to put in place permanent public transit funding after 2026 because we can't just stop funding public transit all of a sudden. Well, the same goes for active transportation. So we're gonna find out how to carve off money from the permanent transit funding after 2026 to permanently fund active transportation. So I think this is here to stay. The lesson that we've learned through CHCI, the Canada Healthy Communities Initiative, was that we managed to get $30.5 million in funding for that. We had applications worth $300 million. So talk about finding a need, right? This tactical urbanism kind of approach to making our communities better. So now we're busy trying to find more money, like substantially more money, so we can continue CHCI. So that's the subversive part, right? Mm-hmm. Almost fool somebody into doing a really good thing, and then you can't stop doing it afterward. I'm being a little cheeky, but I think you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. And Marnie, what type of impact do you think this initiative of this funding will have on the future of active transportation in Canada?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's, I think I touched on it earlier when I said, I think it's going to open up opportunities in sort of mid-size and smaller municipalities and cities that maybe didn't have the sort of in-house either design capability or funding to actually do it on their own. When we think of large cities like Ottawa, Vancouver, Toronto, a lot of the sort of bigger municipalities and cities, they're doing it because they need to get vehicles off the road, and they, it's a bit of a two-pronged approach. It's not just about active transportation and getting people active, but it's about getting cars off the road. But I think in some of these other cities, I think it's finally introducing an opportunity for people to recognize that although I maybe live in a smaller place, I still have that opportunity to participate in active transportation, because now the infrastructure might be there sort of on more rural roads, more rural opportunities, where before it was like a 2-lane highway with no shoulder. Now we'll have a 2-lane, sort of regional highway with a shoulder where people can cycle. And so, that's a bit of a commuter and sort of a more higher end type of cyclist. But even within sort of like town or smaller confines, I think there's going to be a greater understanding that active transportation is for everybody. It's not just a city thing. It can be implemented anywhere.
Thank you. Now, given our aging population and then associated disability rates with this aging population, do you think Canada is well prepared to properly serve these users in the future, even now, what are your thoughts on that? I'm gonna stay with you, Marnie, just to hear your thoughts, and maybe I can go to Andy just to respond.
Yeah, right now I think it's a little bit of a challenge. I think there's not a good understanding of who the potential users are of active transportation. I still think, we've had a bit of a narrow focus about it being for recreation and commuters, and only now I think is that vision broadening about who active transportation is before. I think there's not quite enough understanding about who the users are, but also what are their needs and abilities, but also maybe what are their limitations. So for example, when I used to ride my hand cycle, when you stop on a hill, getting started again is very challenging. And so we have to think about when we're installing active transportation facilities, maybe on giant hills is not the best way. But we also need to think about, maybe there was a senior who used to cycle all the time, is now older, less stable, less strength and stability. Now they want to ride a tricycle because they still want to be active, ride to the market. And so how do we accommodate those types of changing types of equipment? We have more people using cargo bikes, so it's about the same size as an adaptive cycle. And I think we need to be very cognizant of that as we're developing, is understanding that there's a full range of types of cycles out there. That's not just a bipedal, two-wheeled bike out there. I think the education still needs to evolve, just like how building codes started with, a very small amount of information about accessibility and what needed to be addressed. I find we're that way right now with transportation engineering. There's very little information available to practitioners about accessibility. And I think we need to grow that body of knowledge so more people have access to it, other than the people who have access to me all the time. But I think broadening that education will help us get there.
Andy?
We've come a long way because of the work of Marnie and her colleagues across the country, but clearly we have a long way to go. I really hope that the strategy and the fund are going to move us further along in a big way, and I think that they will. This kind of ties back to a comment we were making a few moments ago. I wanted to slide this in, but if folks are familiar with Gil Penalosa's organization, 8 to 80 cities, right? If you design a city for 8-year-olds, it's going to work for 80-year-olds. If you design a city for 80-year-olds, it's going to work for 8-year-olds and everybody in between. So I think as we roll out this kind of infrastructure, that's that sort of guiding philosophy is really important. Marnie, your point about stopping on a hill and getting started. We have a new premier here in Nova Scotia, and he's been in office for about 2 months. And the first thing that he did, was within a day or two of being sworn in, was created an e-bike rebate. So that sort of took off on social media and the AT world across the country, and that's now on my list and the folks I work with in the infrastructure department to try to build the case for e-bike and cargo bike rebates. I think if the core of this is the modal shift that is going to help us to reach net zero by 2050, and that it's going to improve the equity of our communities, then these are important things that we need to think about. And I think those kind of rebates are part of the solution ultimately.
Okay, thank you. And okay, so Andy, you brought up Gil Peñalosa, and he is his brother Enrique Peñalosa. When he was mayor of Bogota, he implemented a tremendous network of infrastructure for active transportation, and there was a lot of opposition from many people in spending or in investing. I see it as an investment, investing taxpayers' money to get something like that going, because there's differences in opinion, right? And even though the ideas were great and it was going to provide accessibility to many people and mobility, there were people that still fought it. And he still pushed through, and he made Bogota an example city for many when it comes to cycling and walking. So when we want to implement certain pieces of infrastructure in some of our Canadian cities, sometimes we get a lot of pushback from residents. And for example, let's think about sidewalks, okay? So you go to new developments, for example, and people don't want sidewalks. They're just saying, no, I don't want a sidewalk. At least that's what it's claimed. How, as planners, as engineers, as people who want to improve active transportation, how can we get over that? How can we address that issue where some residents are saying we don't want sidewalks? We know that sidewalks are important to provide that accessibility. How do we handle that? How do we address that? And I'm asking you because you're dealing with people. You're always you hear so many opinions, and this is dealing with the public.
Well, I mean, you make me think of the classic argument from a business improvement area or a business improvement district in some parts of the country, different names, against bike lanes. We're going to take away 7 parking spaces on these 3 commercial blocks, and it's going to be the end of business as we know it. There is not one piece of data to support that position, right? All the data is the opposite, that people are moving by more slowly, that it's more easy for them to stop and get off, that foot traffic in the shops actually increases in the business district. And that's bankable. That works everywhere. What can you do about it? You can exercise your franchise at the ballot box for one thing. We've got some incredible mayors in Canada who are leading. There are world mayors like in Bogota and others, and Hidalgo in Paris. In fact, it was really fun for a while in the United States. There was Tom Menino was the mayor of Boston, and I'm forgetting who the mayor of Chicago was.
Was it Emmanuel?
Before Rahm Emanuel. It
was
a legacy mayor. There are many of the same name. I can't remember. Dinkins maybe. Anyway, they declared a war. They were going to say who could make the greenest city. And Boston they both just tore out of the gates building active transportation infrastructure. So, I mean, I think there's it's incumbent on all of us to ask of our leaders what we need. And part of that is at the ballot box, but also seeking out opportunities to influence decision making. Every community has boards and committees to sit on, to participate on, to help influence. Organizations like Marnie's have boards that need to have people sitting on the boards. I'm assuming you have a board, Marnie. I don't know for sure. Most organizations like yours many would have a board. I guess I'll leave it there, but yeah, we just have to use our voices.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really good. So I hear that we need to have that political will and that leadership to get these things going.
Yep.
Marnie, I want to go back to you with respect to also along these lines of, and I want to use again the example of the no sidewalks in new developments, for example. And you talked about the legislation, the Canadian human rights legislation, and the different legislation pieces across the country. And one of the I guess components of those pieces of legislation, at least in many cases, is that we need to remove barriers, right, in the built environment. And so my question is, and I have posed this question before to others, and my question has to do with what constitutes a barrier. And so and I think I kind of know the answer, but I want to hear your opinion. Does the absence of something constitute a barrier? And how do you remove the absence of something? And how do you make that case? So in a situation where you don't have sidewalks, for example, is not having a sidewalk a barrier? And how do you remove that barrier?
Right, very much so. So often people, to your point, when they think about a barrier, they might think, oh, it's a sidewalk that's been designed inappropriately and there's no depressed curb or curb ramps. But the absence of a barrier, the absence of a sidewalk is just as much of a barrier, because now people might not feel safe walking along the road. As we know, roads are peaked for drainage, and for some people using a mobility device, that means that when they're walking on the side of the road, they're only using one arm to push with because of the slope of the road. And so these are barriers for people being able to get out of their home. Never mind using it in terms of, trying to get to, for recreation or for fun. For some, it's a barrier to getting to the bus stop. Because quite often, I've seen even in sort of suburban, in Ottawa, older areas, there's no sidewalks, but when you get to the bus stop, it's it's raised, it's all concrete, but then how do you get onto the, the bus stop platform if, if there's no sidewalk. So it's kind of that break in the access chain. If I can't even leave my home to get to the bus, how can I get to school, to get educated, to get a job, to be a contributing member of society, right? So
Yeah.
most definitely, the absence of things is just as much of a barrier as things that are designed inappropriately. And so, I was kind of thinking to myself when you were talking about it that, people who don't want a sidewalk, I think part of it is they don't recognize the number and type of users that would use a sidewalk. So whether it's it could be their own parents walking their children, and creating a safe environment for even that type of activity. So, they wouldn't consider that, perhaps to be active transportation, but for sure it's a recreational thing, and everybody would want their parent and their child to be safe. And so I think, it's important that we, again, consider who are those broader users who are using our infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Now, I see that it's almost quarter after here. So we have about 5 minutes or so, 7 minutes, let's say, left. So I want to touch on a couple other things. I want to ask you about Canada becoming a leader in the safe accommodation of people of all ages and abilities in our transportation system. And I'm going to go to Andy first, and I want to see if you can think of any immediate actions that we can take as a country. And it could be provincially, it could be at the federal level, could be at municipal levels. Any ideas that you may think about as to what needs to happen so that we can become a leader as a country in terms of accommodating safely and efficiently accommodating people of all ages and abilities?
It's a great question. Marnie might remember the name of the act that we've had, the Accessibility Act.
The Accessible Canada Act.
Yeah, thank you. I always go to ADA because that was around for so long and the gold standard.
Right.
So that was a start. I mean, that establishes sort of very broad and in some cases detailed criteria, but that we can unpack and build on. But I think this National Active Transportation Strategy puts us in a really good position, particularly with regard to how successful we might be as we roll it out. So I'll go back to what I said earlier. In all of the consultations, I was secretly also trying to recruit the organizations that were paying attention to help us to publicize and to get this thing in front of people. We have to do whatever we can to build awareness of the benefits, the myriad interwoven benefits of active transportation that we've discussed on today's call. I think it's also important to remember that it's not just about achieving the thing that one of us is focused on. It's not about it's not just about the Twizzy. I learned a new word today, Marnie, thank you. And it's not just about making sure that there's a rural bike path. It's all these things together make a better society. Like we're building a better place, a better Canada. It sounds a little bit high and mighty, I suppose, but I mean, we are the communities that we build, right? Like they're the expression of our aspirations, of what we want to be, who we want to be, what we want our children to experience. So using the tools we have, the act that we've discussed, the strategy that we have now, this incredible generational investment in our communities, as long as those funding decisions are guided by important principles that the federal government establishes general criteria like climate and inclusion and job creation, but really it's the folks that are actually putting the money into the ground and into the projects that will highlight their own priorities. So we've got to get those priorities embedded in each order of government and within organizations that are providing this kind of infrastructure. I think I'll just briefly say I visited the United Nations in I think it was about 2018, and I wasn't invited. I just forced I created an invitation for myself. I wanted to go speak to the people that were running the office of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because I'm a huge fan and I have a T-shirt, So I created an invitation and we had a really nice chat. And the conversation there led to how the UN views Canada as a leader, and there were two areas. One they called us out for was on reconciliation, and of course there is so much further to go on reconciliation, but the UN credits us for being a world leader. And the other was equitable and just society, how we're putting the needs of those who can't speak for themselves higher up with giving them louder voices, I guess you'd say. So I think Canada, it's just the way that we are, that we want to do better for everybody. And if we can all kind of carry that in us, in our work, I think that's really important.
Thank you. And before I go to Marnie, I wanna maybe ask a follow-up question to that. Because when we talk about active transportation, for the most part, people think about the larger jurisdictions, or at least larger cities. But what about the smaller communities that may not have the available resources or even the technical expertise in-house to be able to implement these facilities? What can we do to help them, to assist them, so that they can also be able to design for everyone and join the rest of the cities in terms of this type of infrastructure?
So the fund is absolutely available to rural communities. So that was you asked me earlier what some of the key points of the engagement were. That was one of them, high on the list as well. Safety and accessibility were there, as well as equity. The importance of then allowing some of the fund to be used for planning and design exercises, including public engagement, provides that front door for a rural community that might have a volunteer council and very little infrastructure budget to actually get this work done. So they can use some of the funding to get a consultant to do some consultation with community, to design the network, and then come back to the fund to get money to build the thing, whatever that thing is. So we're not done. This work isn't done until every community has these choices available to them, to not have to buy a car or the choices that other communities have and they don't.
Yeah. Thank you. And Marnie, your thoughts on immediate actions?
I think in terms of accessibility, I think part of it again goes back to that education piece, but also I think we need to start including accessibility provisions, not only in sort of the application process for funding, so that people who want funding also have to demonstrate how they're going to address accessibility as part of it. That's always been something, accessibility has been an afterthought, or just we're going to do it, but I think it needs to be part of that criteria in assessing whether or not projects should get money. And I think by, to Andy's point, the smaller municipalities especially are now able to include part of that engineering and outreach cost as part of their application is really great, because now it enables them to consult with the community of disability groups. It enables them to, look into getting accessibility help with their project. I think that's just really key is educating, but also as standards evolve. So Andy mentioned the Accessible Canada Act that comes from Canada ratifying the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Canada's obligation was the Accessible Canada Act, and flowing from that, of course, are all the national standards that will come out of it. And so there's starting to be this trickle-down effect, but I think accessibility isn't yet quite embedded sufficiently in the sort of transportation engineering field and its importance. Just as how I mentioned sort of much earlier, how accessibility has grown to be embedded in the built environment field in terms of actual buildings, and the recognition that accessibility consultants, are real contributors to the project in terms of, I'm not there to tell you how to design it. I'm there to bring my knowledge about how people with disabilities, approach, access, and use a facility. And I think that's something that's lacking, but it has the opportunity to build across the country as more and more practitioners recognize the value.
Thank you. So basically, there's definitely opportunity for growth in that regard. Right. I can see it. I see it as how we always see the pyramid of mobility, and the automobile is at the top, and then we have pedestrians and cyclists at the bottom. I'm thinking, when I think about the accessibility pyramid, it's almost like we need to invert it. Like we need to make sure that pedestrians and cyclists are at the top.
That's right.
And and that's how we need to design and plan our infrastructure. Maybe I can just take 1 minute or so to give me some parting thoughts on this topic. Maybe I can start with you, Marnie, and I'll leave the last word to you, Andy. How about that?
Yeah, there we go. It's great. I've been reading some of the chats that have gone through, and a lot of people, also have that feeling that sort of accessibility, is becoming more important in everything we do. I really liked, Jeannette, your thought about, the inverted pyramid. So we should put the car on the bottom and put accessibility and diversity and inclusion at the top for all users. And I think if we can get everybody to start thinking about the inverted sort of triangle, inverted pyramid, I think that we would end up with a really great, broad, active transportation network that serves, all users. And so I actually like what you said, and I think I'm going to start sharing it with all my design teams about, this is the pyramid that we should be thinking about. And so I think that was a great point for you, but I think that's what I'm going to take from this. And I just want to wish everybody a really great conference. And I hope what I've shared today is of some value to everybody. So thank you very much.
Andy.
Thanks, Jeannette, and thanks, Marnie. It's been a pleasure to do this with you today, and thanks to everybody for tuning in and the comments that are here. I look forward to seeing us all in person somewhere along the way in the future. So to the pyramid, I just have to follow up on that. There's this great line that says, you design a city for cars, you're going to get a city full of cars. You design a city for people, you're going to get a city full of people. And we have been designing cities for cars since World War II in North America and Canada, and now we're facing the inherent challenges and problems of all that. Completely unsustainable levels of investment into cars and into roads and highways that only ever draw funds, never create wealth. So this reorganization of priorities to put pedestrians first, then active transportation second, then transit, then the movement of goods, and at the very last, single occupant vehicles, right? So we're seeing some jurisdictions pick up this sort of inverted priority, and hopefully one day we can all make that normal. I guess kind of closing, we are at this moment, right? This incredible moment of reinvestment in our communities, and the opportunities are absolutely phenomenal. We're doing our best to provide the tools for communities. I want to encourage people to use their voice when those tools don't seem to be working quite right, or if they're missing the mark, or if there's more of something that's needed or less of something. So that's a journey that we're on together for another. The ICIP goes till 2026, and we'll see what comes after that. But finally, I want to stress again this piece about equity. I mean, when we're to bring it back to AT, we must make sure that our investments are blind to age, to gender, to income, to physical ability. And I loved your line about if you don't build it, they won't come. It's very obvious, but yet sometimes we forget. So let's just all also keep that in our minds and in our hearts as we do our good work. That we need to be doing this for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. And I want to thank both of you. Thank you, Marnie, for your excellent contribution, great insight, very, very a lot of information that we learned today. And thank you, Andy, for your contributions as well. And I want to thank you and the federal government for the tremendous investment in active transportation.
It's a start.
As you have said, this is the beginning of something big, and we really appreciate that as practitioners. I also want to thank before we leave. I want to thank our sponsors and as well as our technical team who is working very hardly behind the scenes here. Steve and Yvonne. For the tremendous job that you are doing. So I am going to now pass it over to James, and he has a few words to say. And thank you again, Andy and Marnie, and you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeannette. Thanks, Andy and Marnie, for the great conversation. I can see with the comments flowing by, all the ideas are flowing. So really a great reminder about why we do these events and why we get together. It's really inspiring to see kind of how easily that comes once we get together and do this. Just a couple things. I just want to acknowledge I think we have we've got people from across the country, but I also saw Beverly Kuhn, who's our current IT International Vice President and our President-elect, connecting in from Texas. So welcome. Welcome to virtual Canada. Hopefully we'll see you in person next year. Also, as Jeannette mentioned, just want to thank our sponsors, and in particular the sponsor for this session, IntelliTraffic. This is the second conference that I've been the chair of and organized, and I can tell you that our sponsors are absolutely critical to making this happen, and it really allows us to keep our registration costs down, and that benefits all of us. Just a couple other things. So we are moving into a break right now. So the first technical tracks begin in about half an hour, so 10 a.m. Pacific or 12 noon. If you look at the schedule, you'll see that we don't have any scheduled lunch break or anything. We are working across 6 time zones, so it's definitely challenging that way. So we've got a couple breaks in there, but obviously just do what you need to do throughout the day to make sure that that makes sense, and you can do that. Use the hashtag CITConf, CONF on social media. You can also tag at IT Canada, on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter for sure. We've got a Twitter stream going for that as well. So keep your eyes out for that. And I think that is basically it. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating in this opening session. We really do appreciate, everybody's attention and all the comments that came through here. And then we will see you at the first technical tracks and throughout the rest of the conference. So enjoy the morning.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.